This video is going to be interesting to different people for different reasons. For some of you who are longtime viewers of my channel, it is going to come as a shock to learn that I was involved in the protracted paperwork process of becoming a citizen of Israel at all. So you're going to learn about the timeline for that, how this idea first came into my head, what my intentions and hopes and expectations were. For some of you, you've never heard of my channel, you don't know anything about me, and you're only interested in the critique of the bureaucratic process itself. Some of you may have searched for this video, searched for terms that led you to this video because you're an applicant, you're someone who's hoping to become a citizen of Israel, and you're maybe concerned about the same hurdles that were a problem for me. You're maybe interested in undergoing the disillusionment process as early as possible as you get deeper and deeper into this demi-monde. And demi-monde is the word of producing paperwork and pastilles for the government of Israel. So Melissa is here off camera with pen and paper, and she's noting down the timestamps when we switch between topics. And after this video is completed, I don't know, 24 hours after this goes up or something, there should be a clickable table of contents in the description of this video. You should be able to see that in the timeline, and you should be able to jump to the portion of the video that interests you most. Oh, here's a great question from the audience. Have you ever been to Israel? The answer is no. But this is the year 2022. The ability of anyone, anywhere, to travel to visit a country before making a commitment of this kind has been very close to nil. And so quite a series of events in my own life led up to this renewed resolution to relocate to Israel, or to do my utmost to get through the bureaucratic process that, as you're going to hear in this video, ends in disaster, ends in failure. But the trip I just made to Thailand for me crystallized. It's funny, we say crystallized. It's such a strange image in our lives. What do you think of when I say crystallize? I mean, does anyone have a small laboratory at home where they mix up crystals and then watch them set in a test tube? Where do we get this image from? Is it from making salt? Do any of you live on the coast where you go out and gather salt crystals from the ocean or something? Yeah, to take something that is unclear and then suddenly give it a hard edge, right? That's when something crystallizes in your life. Yeah, the trip to Thailand, which I still have jet lag from to this day, I'm still recovering from in many ways. That really renewed my interest in relocating permanently to Israel. Now, I'm going to start this video by saying the cultural and political discourse about becoming an Israeli citizen, about becoming an olim or an ole, or whatever you want to say, it's dominated by the idea of toughness. Discourse goes as follows. Life in Israel is tough. Israelis are a tough people. And your problem as a soft outsider is that you don't understand how tough we really are. You aren't tough enough to be one of us. Now, this is an ironic and misleading discourse in many ways. It tells you something about the pride of the Israelis, but also their misplaced pride. On the one hand, they have people who are, however honestly or dishonestly, working their way through this immigration system to escape circumstances of extreme poverty in India, in Africa, in South America, right? I was just reading accounts of, again, so the term they like to use is olim, which is actually the plural. These new immigrants arriving from Brazil, arriving from Argentina with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their back, total poverty, showing up. And from day one, they arrive in Israel and they are 100% reliant on handouts from the social Services Department. They don't speak Hebrew. They've not made any effort to learn Hebrew in advance of the trip. And very often, this is certainly complained about openly in Israel, very often they have a questionable connection to the Jewish religion and the Jewish ethnicity and the history and politics of Israel, if any. So there were a lot of economic migrants going to Israel, again, sincerely or insincerely. In each case, their motivations and feelings may be different, but they're tough, okay? Like the greatest joke of all is the response of the Israelis. The whole political discourse about Aliyah, about becoming an Olim is like, oh, Israel is a tough country and you're not tough enough, right? So that's one side of what's going on here. And then the other thing these people pride themselves on, obviously, in relation to instead people who try to migrate to Israel from Europe, people who try to migrate to Israel from the United States of America, then you can imagine what the Israelis are really saying is they know what it's like to live in a kind of war-torn third world country, and you don't. They're tough. They represent this standard of, not just, it's really not authenticity. The claim isn't that Israelis are more Jewish than you. It's not, interestingly. The claim is that, if you don't like it, get the hell out because you're not tough enough for Israel. So my own situation here, it's amusing on many different levels. It's incongruous and paradoxical in many different ways. I think that the Israeli perception of their own toughness, really it has to do with secularism, cynicism, and political engagement. You're talking about Israelis who, just by sheer dint of real life experience, are incredibly cynical about politics in Israel. Of course, they're engaged and well informed about politics of Israel. And they are receiving, either gladly or reluctantly, from the wealthy Western world, because I've already set aside as a separate category the sort of third world refugees and people just trying to escape from poverty. They are receiving, whether reluctantly or eagerly, very eccentric religious maniacs who, whether they've come from Baltimore in the United States of America or from Berlin, Germany, if you are talking about the sort of person who has grown up going to a theological college, studying in a yeshiva, like if you're talking about people who are really fundamentally disconnected from reality in the modern world, and people who are wanting to go to Israel, those people may think of Israel as an earthly paradise. They may really have these misconceptions, and they may really lack the toughness and even just the kind of, frankly, curiosity and interest and engagement that'll make survival in Israel possible. Now, in some ways, nowhere else on planet Earth is like Israel. One of the funny responses I've gotten from Israelis on the internet is like, well, it's like anywhere else. Yeah, the immigration process is difficult. It's like anywhere else. And every single time I'm right back saying, dude, come on. Like, sorry. This is not like migrating to Jamaica. Like, I don't know if you've really thought this through. The right of return written into Israeli law, the cultural dynamics, the political dynamics, the linguistic. No, my dude. I'm sorry. I'm really actually familiar with immigration law and politics. Many countries in the world. There is nowhere else like Israel. And I think you need to recognize just how deeply committed you are to a very peculiar sort of excuse-making mentality to come at this where your first and initial excuse is, well, it's like migrating anywhere else. It's not. All right. Now there are two sides to this. On the one hand, it shouldn't be like migrating anywhere else. It should be unique. And then the ways in which it's unique and it shouldn't be. But to stick with Jamaica for just one moment, there is an important parallel some of you may not have have thought through, which is this. Um, Many people go on vacation to Jamaica, and they are unaware of the extent to which the experience of being on vacation misleads them as to the political and economic reality of what life in Jamaica is like. Now, with Jamaica specifically, and with other Caribbean islands generally, I knew Black people in Canada who had that kind of experience. Now, for some of them, it may start in their early childhood. Their parents bring them as children, as tourists to these islands. Some of them went in their teenage years or in university. Now, I just mentioned I sympathize in various ways. This is an interesting parallel to, an interesting contrast to the experience of Jewish people in visiting Israel. Well, if you are Black and you live in Canada, you're part of a small minority. All right. So we don't have enormous numbers of Blacks in Canada. In some parts of the United States, if you live in Louisiana and you're Black, you may feel like you're part of the majority, at least in your town, at least in your neighborhood, wherever you live in Louisiana. Well, if you're Black in Canada, you very much feel like an outsider in your own country. You very much feel like you're part of a minority within a minority in Canada. So I can imagine the way in which it might be liberating and empowering to go back to Jamaica or some other Caribbean island your family has a connection to. And there are many reasons why, especially if you are getting on an airplane in the middle of Canadian winter, you might regard life in Jamaica as paradise. A certain kind of person, frankly, I am the kind of person who, if I go to Jamaica, I'm constantly questioning and examining, investigating political conditions and economic conditions. If I'm going to Jamaica, I'm reading the Constitution and I'm reading about current, corruption and police brutality scandals in the newspapers, and I'm going to the museums and I'm looking at the education system and the healthcare system, and I would be interested in political reality in Jamaica. Most tourists are not. Most people who go to Jamaica, even if they have relatives there and so on, they are willing to be seduced. They're willing to regard Jamaica as a kind of paradise. Well, the experience of visiting Israel, even for the most secular of Jews, I think it is fair to say it lulls them into a similar sort of delusion that Israel is paradise. And I remember an example that came up recently. I've been reading books about immigrating to Israel. I've also been listening to podcasts and this sort of thing. But one example was Americans who come over as tourists first, and they never calculate just how difficult it would be for them to afford eating a single meal in a restaurant in Tel Aviv if they were earning their salary in Israeli shekels. So the example was going out to dinner with friends and paying 400 shekels for dinner, and that if you kind of have a normal salary in the United States of America, and also you've saved up for this as a vacation, you might completely thoughtlessly spend, say, more than $100 on dinner in a restaurant. And again, this lulls you into a sense of confidence, lulls you into a sense of optimism about the wonderful life you're going to have if you move permanently to Israel. Well, the point here, the warning is here. They're simply not thinking through economic and political reality from an Israeli perspective. On a deep level, they are assuming that if they move to Israel, it will be a permanent vacation. The vacation experience will go on forever. So we have a comment from the audience. We do have a few Jamaicans who are longtime viewers of the channel, actually. Not surprising, just given the total population of Jamaicans in there. Actually, it's not surprising, though, given that Jamaica has so many vegans. This is something Jamaica has in common with Israel. Big vegetarian population in Jamaica, and then now more and more of those vegetarians are becoming vegan. Junebug writes in, quote, being a lesbian with family connections in Jamaica, I've been forced to analyze that Jamaica is not paradise. Yes, indeed. The status of homosexuals in Jamaica, certainly status of homosexuals in Israel is something easier to boast about. What can I tell you? Anyway, I was saying that partly as a concession to the other side here. So this discourse I've alluded to of Israelis saying, you are not tough enough for Israel, right? Israel is tough. Israelis are tough. That fits into, on the one hand, the sort of the problem of these religious enthusiasts who are really detached from political reality. They are thinking of Israel as pretty much the kingdom of heaven on earth, whatever you want to say. They're thinking of this in magical terms. But on the other hand, I think it's also a sort of confrontation with the optimism that a shallow tourist's engagement with Israel brings about. Okay, so I would now shift to discussing a little bit my own motivations, my own interest in moving to Israel. Why would I ever consider, and I'm now well into my 40s, I'm 43 years old, why would I consider packing up my life in Canada and starting again in Israel? And in case you haven't guessed, I'm not talking about doing this alone. Um, you know, I've got to say, the single greatest regret of my life is this. Okay, look, it's always better to start with a tangible example than speaking in abstract generalizations. When I first got involved with Buddhist scholarship, when I was a scholar of Buddhism studying Buddhist languages and then the history and politics of Buddhist majority countries, places like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, so many different Asian people came up to me and said, "Oh, you're Jewish?" And, I'd say, "Yeah, genetically, yeah, I'm born Jewish." And they would say, "Oh, all the greatest scholars in the field are Jewish. You'll see, everyone worth talking to, everyone you meet is worth talking to is Jewish." This is Theravada Buddhism we're talking about. And every time they said this to me, I would laugh and I would say something challenging back to them, like, on the contrary, a lot of the most famous scholars in the field are anti-Semitic. And I've made some YouTube videos talking about that. There's a remarkable history connected to Sanskrit and Hinduism of anti-Semitism and connected to ancient Buddhism and studies in this field. And I would give examples of that, of famous scholars of Buddhism who were not Jewish, but were in fact anti-Semitic. Yeah, and I did encounter anti-Semitism in the field. But there were actually many moments and many experiences I had that forced me to face up to the extent to which dissident Jewish intellectuals, who were not just a minority of like all the people in Western Europe, not just a minority of all the people in America, but were obviously a tiny minority within Buddhism and a tiny minority within like the academic study of Buddhism, or whatever you want to say. The extent to which, yes, indeed, those dissident Jewish intellectuals, kind of free-thinking, critical Jewish intellectuals, outclassed and outmassed all of the intellectuals from every other stripe, from every other walk of life. Like, I'm just pointing out to you, it would make sense for Jewish studies, pardon me, little slip there. It would make sense for Buddhist studies to be dominated by Japanese people, Tibetan people. Like, there are all kinds of different ethnicities where Buddhism is a huge part of the culture and history. You might think in getting involved in a field like that, you're going to be meeting a lot of Japanese intellectuals or even something like Tibetan Americans or something. No. There was one very memorable scene, and this is memorable to me for more reasons than one. I was in Bangkok, Thailand, and I went to this conference. I went to this event where, there were Buddhist monks attending. None of them were intellectuals, not one. So the Buddhist monks were really in like the blind faith category of people attending this conference. Almost all of the scholars and intellectuals were white foreigners. There was one ethnically Thai scholar, an intellectual. He was hosting the conference. He was the reason for its existence. And, at that conference, there were 3 ethnically Jewish people. There were 3 dissident Jewish intellectuals. And we were the only people asking tough questions. We were the only people willing to talk about, for example, slavery. I'm sorry, I know I always use this example, but it's a great example. Like, oh, gee, so you're a researcher, you're an intellectual working on Buddhism, and for some reason, you get real uncomfortable when we start talking about the history of slavery. Like, what kind of scholar are you? This is ridiculous. The three Jewish intellectuals who were there, myself being one, stood, I was going to say head and shoulders above the other intellectuals there. We towered over them. They were terrified of us. I would even say they hated us. They hated and feared us. So you're at this conference where, by the way, there's more than one moral division within the crowd, within the participants. But there was this very memorable scene at the end of the conference where, I'm standing there with Richard Gombrich. As Richard Gombrich is Jewish. He is a Jewish dissident intellectual, Jewish eccentric intellectual, whatever you want to say here. I'm standing there with Richard Gombrich. He is by far the most famous, most powerful, most influential person at this conference. And you might think all the other little wannabe scholars are going to be gathered around him, trying to curry his favor, trying to get his attention or something. They're not. They're all terrified and keeping their distance. And, so I didn't say this so I have to describe the scene. So the conference has ended, the different kind of formal conference proceedings where we're all forced to sit at the same table together and participate in the same discussion forum together. And it is that moment in a conference when the participants are forming into teams to go off to dinner in different places, go off and have dinner together, go off and further socialize, further talk about research projects, Buddhism, what have you. And it's in a kind of lobby area just out in front of the main doors where the conference proceedings had taken place. And the crowd divided itself into two very distinct groups. Okay. All of the Jews were standing over here, and all of the Goyim were standing over there. It's like, gee, I noticed the attendees at this conference have divided themselves into two very asymmetrical groups, one much smaller in number than the other. And, it's not a simple matter of, look, let me say this. It is not a matter of being born genetically superior, in my opinion. I think you can imagine someone who comes out of a Catholic background, someone who comes out of a background of blind faith, Catholic meditation, frankly, Catholic forms of purification rituals and prayer and meditation and fasting. Someone who comes out of that background and goes into Buddhist scholarship, right? It's totally, totally profoundly different from someone like Professor Gombrich, or myself. Now, I'll just say a few words about what Gombrich and I might have in common. So Gombrich was a Jewish intellectual. His father before him was a Jewish intellectual. What did Gombrich's father write books about? Art history, museums, galleries, fine art, politics of art, paintings, right? What did my father write books about? just pointing out. Okay, so I also come out of a family intensely linked to the Jewish historical, political, and cultural experience. Intensely atheist Jewish family also, but a family shaped by the history of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and all that. And I also come out of a family that wrote and published books specifically about art history, highly political books talking about art history connected to museums and galleries and all that. It's just pointing out, it is remarkable that someone like Richard Gombrich, born into those circumstances and asking those questions, took his own, skeptical steps towards being an author who researched and wrote about Buddhism. In his case, he did it through anthropology of Sri Lanka, Buddhism in Sri Lanka, and then he became a great man in Buddhist scholarship on that road. Well, okay, and I at that time I'm a much younger man, obviously. I took my own path towards Buddhism specifically as a dissident Jewish intellectual. Now, I just point out, so what are the differences? They're innumerable. Why is it that at this conference, frankly, the Jewish attendees are all really serious intellectuals doing really serious, hard-hitting research and asking tough questions, and the Christians, the non-Jewish participants, the people who have basically converted from Christianity to Buddhism, that's the reality of what those people are. They're asking none of those questions. They're not intellectuals at all. They're people, I'm sorry, but they're people of no intellectual substance, no intellectual integrity, no political engagement, whatever. Well, some of those people probably got into Buddhism because they like yoga, because they like rock crystals, because they like meditation. This is the reality. I've had to say this to different people in different contexts and in different ways. I do think modern Judaism, the reality of what Judaism and Jewishness is in the 21st century. I'm not talking about some ancient tradition that goes back to Moses, but what being Jewish means today in the 21st century, rising up out of the ashes of the 20th century. It puts tremendous pressure on you to be an intellectual. It puts tremendous pressure on you to know what you're talking about and be able to defend your opinions, defend your moral claims and what have you intellectually at all times, at the drop of that. And not everyone grows up with that pressure. Some people instead grow up being taught that they should suffer in silence and close their eyes and, salvation through faith alone. And some people grow up with a model of what it is to be an adult that has nothing to do with this kind of self-confident and even slightly desperate assertion of yourself, as an intellectual. Frankly, a kind of constant, desperate attempt to assert yourself as someone who ought to be taken seriously as an intellectual. I think it's a huge part of Jewish cultural identity, and it doesn't work for everyone. I think it's misery for many people. I just mentioned members of my family are not the only. So Ron Sims here, glad to see you, Ron. Just remembering a YouTube video I saw maybe 2 days ago. And this puts the kind of, for me, it was shocking to hear, but perhaps not for everyone in this crowd. There's a YouTube video that's from the specific genre of African-American men complaining that they have to get their act together to be better fathers. So some of you are already going to roll your eyes like, oh, I've heard that before. That's a kind of rich discourse within the United States of America in the 21st century. There is this sense, obviously among some African Americans, that their culture is undermining the next generation growing up. There is this sense of reflecting on their own negative attitudes towards education, the celebration of rap music and gang culture and what that does from one generation next. And yes, just the very, very high rates of single mothers raising children without fathers entirely. And then the question of the quality and quantity of parenting that Black men are providing to their own sons and daughters when they're not entirely absent. So now I remember already 30 years ago, this before YouTube, this was a somewhat crowded area of self-examination and self-flagellation for African Americans. I remember when Bill Cosby was one of the most controversial voices in this debate. No one cares about Bill Cosby's opinion anymore, but there was a time, that was talked about in the newspaper. Oh, Bill Cosby says Black American fathers are letting their own children. Anyway, I saw this YouTube video, and there was a black guy. I'm guessing he has several Jewish friends, or he grew up around Jewish colleagues or classmates or something. And he was just ranting about how much better off he would be if he'd been born Jewish. There's a lot of anti-Semitism amongst African Americans, quite intense anti-Semitism. And this guy was just laying into his own family upbringing and so on. And again, I mean, I've only had a couple of black friends growing up, but I grew up around a lot of black people in Toronto. There's a lot of black people I've chatted with, but like people were really my friends. No, not close friends, but I did grow up around black culture in downtown Toronto. And, he's laying into this culture that only cares about how well you can play basketball and how well you can play football, as opposed to saying, and again, the way he was saying it, I'm guessing he knows some Jewish people, as opposed to having a father and a grandfather who are constantly breathing down your neck and on your case because you're not a medical doctor yet, because you're not an architect yet. Why can't you be an architect like your cousin Shmuel? He's talking about the kind of pressure to succeed in these respectable and intellectual professions that Jewish families put on their own sons. And of course, what do you say? There's a lot of truth to it, And I think you can imagine also, it doesn't work for everybody. There are Jewish men. I saw a Jewish bodybuilding YouTuber lately. I mean, don't worry, this is a real short story. But this guy, I would have never guessed he was Jewish. He has the kind of overly friendly, simple-minded attitudes of like a primary school gym coach. He's one of those guys with enormous muscles. He spends his whole time lifting weights and doing steroids and stuff. And always, hi guys, how you doing? I'm coach whatever. I'm your coach. I'm here to encourage you and do your best and lift. Like, he has this really kind of childlike, totally non-intellectual set of attitudes. And I'd never seen a video before where he had his necklace visible. In one of his videos that I saw, the guy has a Star of David on. I was like, I'm just shocked. This guy, I never would have imagined is Jewish. And I can't imagine how much friction and conflict he has in his whole family. Because I got to tell you something, like not just in my family, but every Jewish family, every Jewish person I ever knew growing up, the contempt for sports, the disdain for sports, the withering attitude, like, oh yeah, you want to run around after a ball? Really? As a grown man, this is what you want to do? Yeah, Melissa's crap. Well, look, I'm sorry, Melissa is from Detroit. Okay, the Toronto and Detroit are adjacent to each other. Well, right, but this is no offense, but I know your family. I'm sure. Would your parents have been disappointed if either of your brothers had become professional athletes? No, I mean, so just saying, this is, we're talking about a really profound fissure between cultures, a profound contrast between cultures that doubtless is produced by some incredibly shallow differences between cultures. And, okay, so we're coming to finally the question, why would I want to move to Israel at all? And in a sense, it's imperfectly parallel to, it's similar to in some ways, why did I ever move to Cambodia at all? Why did I ever move to Laos? The truth is I am a dissident intellectual, and I've been wandering the whole world looking for a place where I really can live as an intellectual, where I really can have colleagues, ideally where I can be a part of a democracy with other intellectuals as my equals. I don't want to live under a dictatorship like North Korea. I mean, ideally, I'd be in a democracy where, you're really engaged with political reality in an open and participatory way. You're not conspiring to bring about political change as you'd have to in North Korea and that kind of repressive dictatorial regime. Well, I was born in a really culturally impoverished, genocidal, anti-intellectual culture. And I think if some of you are watching this in Australia, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about also. Some of you are watching this in New Zealand. Like, it's not just Canada. It's not just the United States. However, what I'm saying here, it's not the same as Denmark, guys. It's not, right? It's not the same as Japan. It's not. I mean, it's not the whole world that has this problem. So let me break down those 3 points, right? Culturally impoverished, genocidal, anti-intellectual. That's what Canada is. Okay. In downtown Toronto, there's a huge multi-million-dollar opera house. And there's a sign next to it, as I recall, for the National Canadian Ballet, getting the name, the Ballet Company of Canada, the National Ballet of Canada. Yeah. Who do you think has better opera? The Canadians or the Czechs? Like, the city of Prague alone, a small city in a small country and a moderately poor country. I mean, Czech Republic has a lot of disadvantages, You will find better opera and better ballet in Prague than you will ever find in downtown Toronto, Canada, right? But there's a deeper problem here, because as bad as our opera is, as bad as our ballet is, that is the only culture we've got. A third-rate imitation of European culture. Now, look, I've been to Prague. In case you haven't guessed, I've seen modern dance in Prague. I didn't see traditional ballet or traditional opera. I did go to the ballet in Prague. I'm not saying this for the sake of construing that the grass is greener on the other side of the hill. We have that idiom, right? We don't have an idiom for the reverse, like where you have to express to Europeans, look, you are failing to appreciate how much greener the grass really is on your side of the hill, because you are sitting in a country that isn't a knockoff, that isn't a phony second-rate imitation of an imperial power built on a basis of genocide. Now, but to make it clear that I'm not just making a grass is greener on the other side of the hill comparison. All right. The intellectual caliber of my fellow Canadians is abysmally, appallingly low. Who's the greatest intellectual to emerge from the University of Toronto in the past 50 years? It's Jordan Peterson. Okay. That's my alma mater. That's the university I come out of. Jordan Peterson is the most famous, the most influential, the most significant author and intellectual, especially on politics, to be produced by the University of Toronto, to be produced by all of Canada in the last 50 years. You want to make a top 10 list? There's no one even comparable to him. In case you can't guess, I utterly despise Jordan Peterson, right? Let's keep it real. The intellectual level at the University of Toronto and at every university I've been at in Canada, I've been at many. It's not worth rehearsing my whole life story here. It is absolutely appallingly low. However, I was married to a woman and I was with a woman while she went through the process of completing her PhD, at Cambridge University, England. I had a lot of direct experience with Cambridge University, England, Oxford University, England, and University of London, SOAS, University of London. All right. And the abysmally poor intellectual quality of those universities in England, right? It's not a contrast to Canada. It's not a situation of saying, well, this is one side of the hill, this is the other side of the hill, the grass is greener, the grass is greener on the other side of the hill. I think it's really important to understand that this is a cause and effect relationship, right? The Canadian system of education, the Canadian tradition of education is a transplant of, it's a branch of the British tradition. Now, it's worse. I mean, education in Canada is worse than education in England. Healthcare in Canada is worse than healthcare in England. Democracy in Canada is worse than democracy in England. But all of these systems, all of these structures, all these cultural traditions, my point here is not to say that in England they're wonderful. In England, they are also bad. But it's important to appreciate that the situation here is even worse. So, I am someone who was in many ways trying to escape from and compensate for the intellectual poverty of Canada, of the place I was born into, that I had no choice about being born into. Anna was someone who was trying to compensate for this country's history of genocide. Now, I think it's important to emphasize this, even if briefly, because we're talking about Israel. And naturally, a lot of people who are morally opposed to Israel, they will construe their argument against Israel in precisely genocidal terms. They'll claim that Israel is based on genocide against the Palestinian people, so on and so forth. Well, quite a contrast to the significance of the word genocide in Canada and the Great Lakes area of the United States of America, so on and so forth. There are genocides and then there are genocides. Now, I'll just say, when I first left Canada, I really felt that I stood at a crossroads where, I really understood what it was I had to do to escape from Canada, intellectually. And it was like, well, either I'm going to embrace learning a group of Southeast Asian languages. So these are languages like Burmese, Cambodian, etc. Either I'm going to get on that path, and that involves a very clear political struggle for the future of democracy in Cambodia, political struggle for the future of democracy in Myanmar. I'll come back to this. None of us had any idea how bad the future of Thailand would be at the time. We're going back to like 2001, 2002, 2003, even 2005, 2007. The most cynical and most pessimistic of us, nobody thought Thailand was going to turn out the way it did. Okay, so that's one path in front of me, right? And then the other path was to commit seriously to First Nations languages and First Nations politics. And that struggle within Canada, the struggle against genocide, again, now in the end game to cultural genocide, so that languages like Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, and so on will have a future in the 21st century and the 22nd century instead of disappearing and becoming dead languages, which is exactly what's happening, by the way. I have made many other videos talking about that. Now, in both cases, I'm motivated by a sense of humanitarian agency of wanting to change the world, want to make the world a better place. I'm motivated by an awareness of the difference I can make and the difference I cannot make. For me, one of the single most important differences between the Southeast Asian path, which again involves, it's not just scholarship, it involves humanitarian work, it involves politics, it involves, this kind of struggle for a better tomorrow for millions of people, not just myself. The difference between that struggle and the struggle of First Nations people had everything to do with the existence of the corpus of literature. I was still a relatively young man, and I felt really disgusted with the mediocrity. Mediocrity is too kind a word, frankly. I was disgusted with the stupidity of the entire corpus of Western literature. I didn't want to spend my own time reading Jane Eyre or Shakespeare or Batman, like high or low, right? I had no respect for Immanuel Kant. I had no respect for G.W.F. Hegel, all stuff I've read huge amount. I had no respect for Karl Marx. There's a big name. Like all of the big names in the Western philosophical canon, political canon. Sorry, also if we get into pure political literature, do you think I have any respect for Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan? Do you think I have any respect for Thomas Paine? Indeed, sir, we've been talking a lot about Thomas Jefferson. These are just laughably stupid and immoral and evil authors to me. I was very well read and all this stuff. How about Thomas More's Utopia? Someone who at that age and stage of life was really familiar with what I was missing out on in terms of the whole Western tradition, ancient and modern, high and low. Because again, things like Batman matter too. Do you want to have a child? Do you want to raise your child going to Disneyland? Do you want to raise your child reading Batman? And do you want to raise your child telling them that Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet represents some kind of higher intellectual ideal? For me, the path of getting involved with even a place as hopeless as Myanmar and places as hopeless as Cambodia was that there was this profound literature. There was this massive corpus of texts of philosophy and so on that I could make my own, that could become my literature that I live with, and that meant a lot to me. That meant a lot to me short term and long term. And sure, look, obviously there's a contrast here to the Judeo-Christian Bible. I'm sorry. Do you think I'm proud of Noah's Ark as a story? Even within the text, without getting into the Easter Bunny and all this horse shit, the actual the literature of the Bible, considering the Bible as literature, the only thing that's entertaining about it is debunking the misconceptions of others. The extent to which people delude themselves about what the Bible supposedly says as opposed to what it actually says. I understand that's a kind of sport. But so in case you haven't guessed, I have studied the Bible. I've also read the Quran and the Hadith, by the way. I knew what I was missing out on. Great question for the audience. What are the chances that Richard Gombrich ever reads No More Manifestos? Well, I will tell you, Clouds, one of the most senior people in Buddhist studies, not Richard Gombrich, but another retired professor who's a big name. He has read both Future of an Illusion and No More Manifestos. I know he has copies of both texts, and I assume he hasn't finished them yet. But I do know that some of my old contacts in the world of Buddhist scholarship, they are looking at my work. And for some of those guys, there's a wistful awareness that I was the one who got away. I was one of the very few talented, hardworking, passionate people in the field. And instead, I ended up writing political philosophy in this totally different category or discipline. We get some other votes from the audience that Immanuel Kant is not worth reading. Look up Kant's racism in anthropology. It's really nuts. Anyway, he was just an imbecile. Um, I have no respect for Kant whatsoever. I have no respect for Descartes. Jeez, Cartesian doing. Actually, so look, yep, the sexism too, and everything else. Yeah, and another great question from the audience. If your child goes to any public or even private school, is it even possible to educate your child without Batman? These are the choices you're making. But if you haven't raised a child in Cambodia, it's different, homie. I mean, if you have right now, Sri Lanka, buy the dip, man. Any one of you can probably afford to buy a retirement home in Sri Lanka if you raise your kids. And these are really profoundly different cultures. You'll be dealing with problems, but you will not be dealing with the same problems. All right, so look, Canada, tremendous intellectual poverty, tremendous cultural poverty. The culture is incredibly thin and phony. It's just not a lot to work with culturally. And then there is this issue of Canada being built on genocide. I was, in a very real sense, trying to escape that in starting a new life, whether you think of that as in Cambodia or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and in embracing that, that set of academic disciplines, that kind of humanitarian work, that kind of research. Well, in many ways, the same logic applies to the disaster that is modern Israel. I was a rare example of someone, and again, this is a contrast to the whole discourse about Aliyah and Olim and so on. I was somebody who was attracted to Israel, not despite its political problems, but because of its political problems, right? Now, again, look, I've got to say, the commentary earlier about Jamaica, some of that's true of Myanmar also. Some of that's true of Cambodia, Thailand, or any of these places. Like, if you want to have a luxury vacation in Myanmar or a luxury vacation in Cambodia, the same way that you can have a luxury vacation in Jamaica and not deal with any of the social, economic, or political reality, it can be done. I think every year, many thousands of tourists, if not many millions, they accomplish this. They have a totally, misleading experience at a 5-star hotel, which has a big wall around the perimeter with barbed wire and armed guards, and they see the beach in any one of these countries. All right, some people who go to Myanmar are going there despite the poverty, despite the political problems, and some people are going there because of it. Right? They want to be part of the solution. They want to deal with. They want to tackle those political problems. So likewise, my attraction to Israel was the idea of going there not despite the political problems, but because of them. Now, in terms of what was going on in my life leading up to this decision, I had finished writing these 2 books. And as long, I may not have been working on those books every day, 12 hours a day or something. I wasn't. There were significant periods of time where I was, frankly, just lying around in bed with Melissa here. We were just enjoying ourselves. But every day in which I hadn't finished those books, it was on my mind. It was, my whole things to do list was preoccupied by writing those books. And those books are the culmination of a lifetime of work for me. They have a tremendous sense of finality for me. This is really kind of everything I have to say about political philosophy. They're my first books, but they feel like my last books because they have such a sense of finality for me. And there was such a sense of importance and stress for me in writing them and really making sure everything was as perfect with them as possibly could be. Having finished those books, I was at a crossroads in my life where I was really ready to take on new challenges. In 2016, when I talked to the Aliyah officials, I was not. In 2016, I was still actively struggling to learn Chinese. And I was thinking, well, what if I move to Israel? There is a Chinese program, like Chinese language, Chinese politics, modern China, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Okay, so can I switch from the Canadian university system, which is terrible, into the Israeli university system, which is maybe less terrible, and continue with what I'm doing in an academic sense with my research and my career path working on Chinese? Well, you have to take your commitment to learn Hebrew as a language seriously if you're going to migrate to Israel. There's no point moving to Israel and living entirely in an English-speaking ghetto. Obviously, if you were going to migrate to Israel, you are embracing the challenge of learning enough Hebrew to participate in civic and political life there. So as soon as I'd finished the books, many things that had formerly been unthinkable became thinkable. The trip to Thailand changed me in a way I didn't anticipate at all. And this really provides the context for, and it lit the fuse for this attempt to do the bureaucratic paperwork to become a citizen of Israel. I have said to Melissa many times during this relationship, I can still speak Thai. I can still speak Laotian. I put in the years of hard work to really know a lot about this country, the history, the politics, the language. I can still speak these languages well enough to get by. There's a basis there. And then obviously, if I start putting in the work within a couple of years, I'd progress toward fluency. And something I'd said to Melissa again and again is, look, Thailand is a country we could end up retired in. It's a country we could end up living in long term. Like, even if it's not plan A or plan B, like, keep in mind Thailand is an option somewhere in the list as plan D, plan E, or plan F. You know what I mean? And it's an understatement to say that I felt positively about Thailand that way. You guys may or may not know this about me, but in the final months of my relationship with my first wife, the months leading up to the divorce, a divorce I initiated, I dumped her, I decided to break up with her. It's not the other way around. A divorce I'm very glad I got. I never regret breaking up with my first wife. Nevertheless, in the months leading up to that divorce, we relocated from France to Taiwan. And my ex-wife and I discussed it was an option that instead we could have relocated from France to Thailand. All right. So if you don't know this, my ex-wife spoke Chinese. At that time, I spoke Thai and Laotian quite well. In Taiwan, we were in a situation where I was just starting to learn Chinese, and she was speaking Chinese everywhere. She was the one who could speak the local language. Obviously, if we had been in Thailand, that would have been the opposite. I would have been the one speaking Thai and speaking Laotian and making all the arrangements, running around and getting things done. And my ex-wife would have, in effect, been able to relax, whatever you want to say. She would have stood there silently while I did the talking. And we'd been in that situation before. She'd traveled through Laos with me before, and she traveled in Thailand with me a bit. She'd seen me interpreting and speaking the language. So, that creates a very strange symbolic power for Thailand in my life, my autobiography, and looking back on what was and what might have been. And I've lost so many years working so hard, studying so many languages. There's always the question of, what if I just stuck with Laotian? What if I just stuck with Thai? What if I just kept on with those languages and that politics? Instead of making the attempt, heroically, but utterly in a self-destructive manner, to start again with a new language, again and again and again. So look, I I had a lot of positive feelings about Thailand. I'm sorry, I've just got to say this again. What I liked about Thailand, right? It doesn't arise from closing my eyes to the political problems there. It's not because I think of Thailand as a vacation destination where I'm cut off from that political reality. Like, what I liked about Thailand, both in my experience living there in the past and in the idea of living there in the future, was precisely an engagement with those political problems, that political reality. Going back to Thailand, just a couple days ago now, I felt disgusted. I felt disgusted to have my name connected to that country in any way. And what I'm talking about here is partly a rational response to political conditions. Like, it's partly a rational analysis of political reality. But it is partly a feeling. Like, I'm telling you how I feel, not how I think. I never thought I'd feel that way about Thailand. I never thought I'd feel that this is something dirty and loathsome and disgusting. This is something I don't even want mentioned in my CV. Like, I don't want this mentioned in my resume that I've ever been in this country, that I ever had a career or scholarly interests, connected to this country. The change in Thailand's political character, right? You can't mark one day on the calendar when it happened. There was no revolution. I can only compare it to the situation with Vladimir Putin in Russia. I think if you talk to someone in Russia who cares about politics, it's not someone who's an expert, but someone who really reads the newspapers and cares about politics more than average, a Russian citizen. If you take someone like that aside in Russia and ask them, look, at what point exactly did your country stop being a democracy? I don't think they can give you an answer. Now, conversely, maybe if you ask 10 different people in Russia, maybe they give you 10 different answers, but it's not the case that the first day Putin was elected, Russia ceased to be a democracy, right? There has been a gradual and, difficult to adumbrate transformation of Russian society from top to bottom. And at some point, we all woke up in the morning and realized that the promise of Russian democracy has become utterly hollow and utterly phony. That Russia is not a democracy. It merely has a veneer. I already knew that about Thailand before this trip. All right. I already knew that. But on this trip, I felt it. I really felt it. I felt like this country makes me want to puke. This country makes me ashamed of myself. This is so loathsome, And again, I think I've given you a pretty good narrative up to this point, explaining that a part of my reason for going to Thailand in the first place, part of my reason for getting involved with places like Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, was exactly my sense of moral revulsion at what Canada is. Canada, this genocidal, third-rate British colony, and so on and so forth. So I just say my interest in becoming an Israeli, frankly, it's like dominoes falling. It's a very simple cause and effect relationship. I'm there in Thailand feeling this intense form of revulsion and regret. I regret that I ever did this in the past, that I ever studied this language. Before the trip, I was all gung-ho. I was going to try to make the most of the trip in terms of studying the language, like reviving my ability in the language. I was going to film myself talking to people in Thai and Laotian and showing how to study the language and encouraging people. and instead I felt very suddenly, I felt this tremendous sense of regret that I'd ever put 5 minutes into this language. And like, again, so we already used this image of crystallization. Something that's vague and unclear suddenly has a hard edge to it. Something is as clear cut as a diamond, there's no way I can ever be a dissident intellectual who has colleagues, who lives among other dissident intellectuals he regards as his equals in Thailand, right? And of course, the very beginning of this, monologue is to say, I don't feel there's any way I can ever have that in Toronto, Canada, or in Vancouver, Canada, or in Victoria, Canada, or in Quebec City, Canada, or Ottawa, Canada, right? But I mean, like the intellectual caliber of Thai society and the life that's possible for me there as an intellectual, right? It's absolutely abysmally terrible. So yeah, Ron Sims is saying he feels that way also. I've heard a couple different African Americans actually reflecting on that just recently on YouTube, and I don't know. I mean, it's certainly a positive sign that those questions are at least being asked, right? So, look, like dominoes falling, that then brought me back to this question of, could I have a better life? Should I have a better life in Israel? I don't have a delusion that 100% of people in Israel are intellectuals, or specifically like secular atheist dissident intellectuals. I realize that's a minority, right? I don't have the delusion that the majority of people in intellectual are vegans, right? But guess what? Israel does have one of the most intense vegan cultures in the world, or subcultures. It has one of the most intense intellectual subcultures in the world. It certainly has one of the most intense political cultures in the world. So if you are a cosmopolitan intellectual, cares about politics, cares about veganism in particular, if what you want to do is talk about politics on YouTube, it's hard to think of a better place in the world that you might do it than Israel. So I think you can see a plan starting to come together. Okay, so next chapter here. And unless you guys have some pressing questions, I think this is the final chapter. Why was it impossible? Why couldn't my migration to Israel work out? Why wasn't this an option for me? The right to return, as it is called in Israel, certainly using a very poetic concept of return. It is not in the Constitution. It is written down in a law in Israel from the year 1950. So it's often referred to as being in the Israeli Constitution, as being a constitutional principle. I had a somewhat hilarious email from a representative of the Jewish agency. I got it this morning. Whenever they sent it, that's when I got the email. And so this is an Israeli government bureaucrat, in effect. This is an employee of the Jewish agency. And this person had the temerity to say to me, look, the right to return isn't a philosophical concept. It's a law, and there are these bureaucratic procedures attached to it, and this is what we've got to do. And my reply to that was, I don't care if they put this up on their dartboard at the office and throw darts at it. They can hate me for this all they want to. Of course, the right to return is a philosophical concept. I said, you can't tell me it's not a philosophical concept. I've read the law. I looked up the text of the law. The law is declaring a philosophical concept. Now, generally speaking, what legislation is all about is taking a philosophical concept and giving it procedural and bureaucratic form, okay? So guys, the right to bear arms is a philosophical concept. Freedom of speech is a philosophical concept. And then people write a law, right, that takes that philosophical concept and explains to you how government money and authority and violence is going to make this philosophical concept a reality in the real world. Now, some of those philosophical concepts are harder to implement than others. Here in Canada, parents do not have the right to beat their children, to whip or spank your children. How do you think the government of Canada enforces that? How do you think that concept is made a reality? So I've encountered a lot of kind of phony and misplaced cynicism of this kind in the short but eventful time since I gave up on becoming a citizen of Israel. And I've heard a lot of different people's perspectives on it. But what that law says, what it sets down, is the idea that anyone who is a Jew, and if you guys want to, we can start to unpack and discuss further the definition of who is and who is not a Jew. Anyone who is a Jew has the right, the absolute right, to have shelter in Israel, to be like a refugee in Israel, to escape persecution, to escape their circumstances in Israel, right? And to become a citizen of Israel, period. Right? So let me make this clear. Aliyah, becoming a citizen of Israel, becoming an Olim, it's not a job interview. It's not about me convincing you that I'm the best person for the job, right? It's not a test of my moral character. It's not a test of how economically successful I am or how highly educated I am. It's not a test of whether or not I would be a good citizen of Israel. You can literally be mentally retarded, all right? And this really happens. There are mentally disabled people, and part of the reason for moving to Israel is that they'll have a better quality of healthcare in Israel, all right? The law is black and white. You have the right to return, period, if you are a Jew. And the exception, the limit, is for matters of national security, threats to public safety. Okay. Now, a lot of people misinterpret this point. Okay. A lot of people think, and if you read what's written on websites like from these, frankly, really dishonest agencies that are, in my opinion, scamming people like NBN, hear what they say. They do not say that if you have a criminal record, you'll be prevented from entering Israel. The right of return is for everyone, including convicted criminals. The law doesn't say anything about that. The law doesn't say if you're a criminal, you can't become an Israeli citizen. It doesn't say that, right? No. You would have to have committed a crime of such a nature that it would be considered, right, a threat to public safety, a threat to national security. That you are a threat to public safety now, today. So what most of the websites say is somewhat vaguely, well, it would have to be a very serious crime, something like murder. So they say. But even then, if you'd already been convicted for murder and done your time and gotten out of jail, I don't think that would even reach the criteria. So what NBN has done, so if you don't know what NBN is an arm's length agency. It started off as a charity, and then since the year 2008, it has increasingly started behaving as if it were a branch of the Israeli government. NBN has its own agenda, it has its own biases, and with or without the encouragement of the Israeli government, they have massively proliferated the paperwork required to go through the process of Aliyah. So in my case, and this is closely parallel to my experience with the Canadian military when I signed up to fight in the army here. They have a requirement that I need to get paperwork from the government of every country around the world that I have lived in for 1 year. Okay. I have lived in England for more than 1 year. I have lived in France for more than 1 year. I have lived in Cambodia for more than 1 year. I have lived in Laos for more than 1 year. I believe I've lived in Thailand for more than 1 year. You have to look at it. Maybe it was broken up in chunks. lived in Hong Kong for more than a year, right? Lived in Taiwan for the 1 year. So the burden of paperwork created for me, just this one requirement, that would already be an impossible to overcome series of barriers that takes the principle of the right to return, drags it through the mud, discredits it, renders the whole thing a joke. Now, here's the catch. Those requirements are not really legal requirements. So why? Because I just told you what the law says. You guys can go and read the law for yourself. It's a very simple, stark law. The law doesn't say you only have the law to return. The law doesn't say you only have the right to return if you can provide a mountain of paperwork from every single country around the world you've ever spent a year in. The law doesn't say you only have the right to return if you have no criminal record. There's nothing about that. And so I'll just include at this point, might or might not be the best point in the conversation to mention. They require a lot of paperwork pertaining to your divorce or divorces and your ex-wife. They basically want me to get signed permission from my ex-wife and my daughter from my first marriage to become a citizen of Israel. Well, that's not going to happen. When the legislators wrote this right to return, do you think they only wanted people to be able to become Israeli citizens if they could get a permission slip from their ex-wife? It's ridiculous. And let's just say hypothetically my ex-wife hates my guts. Hypothetically, right? Is that a threat to public safety in Israel? Is that like tantamount to, terrorism? That's really what we're talking about, the threat to public safety, right? As on a larger scale, the government of the state of Israel, they actively want as many secular, modern, educated Jews as possible coming into the country to work, to earn money, to support the future of the country. The state of Israel, their position is, hey, these religious maniacs who spend their whole life in a yeshiva, like people who literally spend their whole life chanting and reciting prayers and engaged in textual study of the Torah, they're like, yeah, we've got that covered here in Israel. We have like a large enough percentage of the population already consists of religious maniacs. That's not like their immigration policy. They're not out there hoping to build up their numbers of religious maniacs, right? The state of Israel is very actively interested in recruiting people who are nominally Jewish. And they're doing it right now in Russia. They're doing it right now in Ukraine. There are people who are really, by no stretch of the imagination, Jewish, who really are economic migrants and refugees escaping from Eastern Europe to have a better life in Israel. And, my point being, they don't practice Judaism as a religion, and they're not connected to it by blood or DNA. There are a lot of people the state of Israel is very happy to recruit. There's a huge Russian-speaking minority in Israel, and they are a vital part of the economy and society. They're happy to have more Russians. They're happy to have more Ukrainians, even when their connection to Judaism is, shall we say, nominal at best. And I've seen interviews on YouTube of people. The couple I'm remembering were specifically Ukrainian. They were blonde Ukrainians who openly said they're devout churchgoers. They're practicing Christians. They're Eastern Orthodox Christians. And that when they got to Israel, they were going to continue being devout, practicing Christians. So these weren't even secular modern people. But, the state of Israel wants more people like Adam Sandler. They want more people like Jerry Seinfeld. They want modern, secular, cosmopolitan Jewish people to be part of the economy and part of their political process too, to participate in democracy there. They're not really wanting a whole lot more people who, spend their whole life reciting ancient Jewish poetry, and quoting rabbinical commentaries. It's not what they're looking for. Okay, well, guess what? The government of Israel works with this agency, NBN, and they instead have the exact opposite bias, right? Like this agency is by and for religious maniacs. And I've now heard several other people confirm this. They're totally hostile towards you if you're married to a non-Jewish person. State of Israel is the opposite. They want that. They actively want Jews marrying and bringing in secular non-Jewish people. That's exactly what they do want. They don't want to be a country of inbred redneck religious maniacs. Well, guess who you're dealing with at NBN, right? And again, several other people tell me the same stories. And the person we talked to at NBN, they didn't even know the marriage laws. I knew all this stuff. I've just been doing the reading recently. I knew it like the back of my hand. I knew all the laws and procedures. And this woman on the other end of the line was like, oh, well, I don't know about that. I mean, okay, you'll have to talk to the Jewish agency about that. Anything that's contrary to NBN's, religious agenda, they say, I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to talk to you about it. Go deal with the Jewish agency. And the irony is NBN's current status and their funding from the government of Israel is precisely so that the Jewish agency doesn't have to directly deal with people like me. It's an attempt to, quote unquote, streamline the paperwork. I also do think the government of Israel is doing this quite intentionally so that they can create these quasi-legal barriers to immigration. Because the law, the right of return, has none of this in it. There are no such caveats. There are no such criteria to fulfill. Either you're Jewish or you're not. Either you need refuge or you don't. Either you become a citizen or not. It's very simple binary checklist. And as I say, there's one checklist, there's one check mark in there for whether or not you're an active threat to public security, whether or not you're some kind of terrorist, which of course, nothing to do with these other hurdles you're supposed to jump through. So I suspect that the state of Israel has allowed or encouraged this proliferation of frankly illegitimate paperwork because they feel it's in their interest. Now, sorry, just to come back to this point very briefly, the people who advise you to not quit, what they say is, well, hire a team of lawyers, just move to Israel, like move now on a tourist visa, and then work with this team of lawyers to go through the process like in Jerusalem. And what you'll find is step by step, the agency for Aliyah that's there in Israel, they will waive each of these requirements. They will discard them. They will say the paperwork is not necessary. Now, that is only possible because the paperwork has no legal validity. Okay, it's like, this is the thing, like implicitly that is implicitly that is affirming the analysis I'm giving you here. That doesn't contradict it. The fact that it's possible to hire a team of lawyers to advocate for you and to get these requirements dismissed one by one. Okay. But guess what, guys? If that's the reality of how immigration works in Israel in the 21st century, then I don't want to be any part of it, right? If I am not welcome to come in the front door telling the truth, right? I'm not interested in finagling my way through the back door. What I've said to Israelis and discussing this again and again is, well, guess what? Israel has just put itself on the same level as Cyprus, okay? Because if I hire a team of lawyers in Cyprus, I can become a Cypriot. I can become a citizen of Cyprus too. There are a lot of countries around the world where for a few $1,000s and a few years patience and working with a team of lawyers, you can find your way in a back door to getting a new passport, right? That's not what I signed up for, right, with the state of Israel. What NBN is doing here and what the state of Israel is allowing NBN to do is setting up a fundamentally hostile and adversarial relationship between me as the applicant and the country I'm applying to join. So look, in wrapping this up, moving to Israel would be a tremendous sacrifice. It would be a terrible sacrifice. Just learning Hebrew alone, years of hard work, Certainly less rewarding than working on Chinese. I think it's an open question. Would it be less rewarding than working on Japanese? Melissa and I could make Japan work too or something. You know, the question I have to ask, would that be more or less rewarding than working on Greek? If you guys have a long memory, there was a time we were studying modern Greek. Okay, so you're going to do this huge amount of work to integrate yourself into a society where maybe 60% of people are religious maniacs and hate you. You are going to commit for your children and grandchildren to do compulsory service in the Israeli military. Huge sacrifice for me, huge sacrifice for my descendants, for my daughter, because my daughter's a citizen of France, daughter of already God. Obviously, that would be optional. She could choose if she's tempted by Israeli military service or not. But if I have another child with Melissa, this is a really serious long-term commitment. And yeah, the seriousness of that commitment, of saying, yeah, you know what? I'm going to choose to lend my voice to the debate, the democratic debate about what the future of Israel should be. Like, that's what I'm committing to, at age 43, to say, okay, between age 43 and age 63, I'm willing to make that my political question, my political struggle, no matter how doomed it may be, no matter that 60% of the other people in that struggle hate me, despise me, right? Like 20% of them hate me because I'm Jewish, right? And then like another 40% hate me because I'm not Jewish enough, right? You're going to get both in Israel, right? And I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to do that with the rest of my life. Lifelong commitment, intergenerational commitment. Just because I know how hopeless it would be for me to dedicate the same years of my life to the future of democracy in Canada. And because I'm in no way blind to the extent to which, say, 60% of the population are religious maniacs in Texas, in Georgia, in Florida, whether it's exactly 60% or more like 80%. If you live in Atlanta, Georgia, if you're Jewish right now in Atlanta, Georgia, if you are specifically a Jewish dissident intellectual in Georgia, I had to take this kind of view of Israel and what my future in the country might be like. So it is incredibly demoralizing to see the extent to which the promise of the right to return, the promise that no matter how bad life might get for you in Canada, there's always a way out if you're going to make this commitment to the language, this commitment to the politics, and a commitment that involves inevitably military service for someone. I'm too old for military service. I asked and looked into it years ago. I would have been willing to do military service in Israel. To find out that if you want in Israel, you're going to have to hire a team of lawyers, that it's going to be the same as worming your way in to a passport from Malta, a passport from Portugal, or a passport from Cyprus. That's deeply, deeply demoralizing to me. And I don't think it would have been possible for me to ever get over that initial sense of antipathy, where I'm volunteering to work for the future of Israel in my way, from my utterly atheistic perspective, where I'm willing to be a dissident intellectual in Israel, engaged with the question of the future of Israel. And instead, from day one, the Jewish agency that was literally created to save you, to rescue you, no matter how downtrodden and disadvantaged you might be, an agency that in principle is supposed to be taking you in, even if you are utterly penniless and hopeless, even if you are a refugee in the strictest sense of the word, fleeing persecution, that instead of helping you, instead of being your friend and your ally, that agency is instead, your adversary. So that's it. I will never be a citizen of Israel, and I'm left to look back on the years 2016 to present, the years of my life in which this option existed, in the back of my mind, in which there was always the challenge there that if I could just be, frankly, hardworking enough to take on the Hebrew language, if I could be tough enough to deal with political and economic conditions in Israel, that I could take on this whole new life with, frankly, the same kind of inspiring possibility of making a positive difference in the world there on the horizon. The same kind of inspiring possibility that drew me towards post-war economic disaster areas like Cambodia in the first place.